Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to help you with your important work and to discuss the Department of Defense role in relation to civilian border authorities. My comments today are distilled from the longer, more detailed written statement I have submitted to you, and I would ask that that written statement be made a part of the Commission's record. I am the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense, serving under Assistant Secretary Paul McHale in the Office of the Secretary. I'm a career member of the Senior Executive Service, and at the time of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, I was serving as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Integration. Soon after the attack, Secretary Rumsfeld designated then Secretary of the Army Thomas White to manage the day-to-day execution of Homeland Security and defense activities in the Department on a temporary basis. And in January of 2002, I was appointed as a Special Assistant for Homeland Security, managing a newly created Homeland Security Task Force, which served as a temporary bridge between the immediate post-9/11 aftermath and the establishment of new Homeland Defense and civil support organizations within the Department. To provide the necessary context for my remarks, it's important to make the distinction between Homeland Security and Homeland Defense and the very different but complementary roles of the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security in those activities. Stated simply, the Defense Department provides the military defense of our nation from all attacks that originate from abroad, while the Department of Homeland Security aims to protect the nation against and prepare for acts of terrorism. The Department of Defense is organized and prepared, however, at the direction of the President and the Secretary to support the Department of Homeland Security's mission. In understanding DoD's activities in relation to the border, it's important to understand that there is a nexus with DoD's support in the counter-narcotics arena and to recall a tragic incident in 1997 that had ramifications for how that support is executed. Department of Defense active and reserve component forces and the National Guard have provided a wide variety of counter-narcotics support to drug law enforcement agencies along the southwest border of the United States since 1989. Including surface and aerial reconnaissance, minor construction, establishing tactical observation posts, training, intelligence analysis, linguistic support, transportation, and training exercises along the border to provide terrain denial. On May 20th of 1997, near the border in the vicinity of Redford, Texas, an active-duty Marine performing a counter-narcotics mission tragically killed a U.S. citizen in self-defense. Subsequently, DoD concluded that it would no longer provide support that would place active and reserve component forces in situations in which confrontations with U.S. citizens might occur. National Guard personnel acting in state status were, however, permitted to continue to perform ground missions. It's also important to underscore that the Homeland Security Act of 2002 now gives the Secretary of Homeland Security the responsibility for the security of our nation's borders. And DoD's role in border security is to provide support to those civil authorities, again, principally the Department of Homeland Security, when appropriate. I'd now like to respond directly to the 4 areas of interest related to border security that were identified to us by the Commission. First, what action did DoD take to secure borders immediately after the 9/11 attacks? As detailed in the written statement I've submitted, DoD engaged in a number of actions to improve Homeland Defense and provide interim support to border authorities immediately following and then in the months after the attacks. These included, for example, Operation Noble Eagle, which involves air patrols over key domestic locations, U.S. Navy ships deployed off the coast with anti-aircraft systems and integrated air defense assets located in the National Capital Region. Deployment of National Guard troops operating under state control but with federal funding to guard some 421 airports, and U.S. Navy support for Coast Guard Homeland Security patrols, and the mobilization of 1,600 National Guard troops along the southern and northern borders to support the Customs Service, Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the Border Patrol in their heightened security postures. The second area of interest is the strategic role of the military in anti-terrorism, including protecting against infiltration of the United States by terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. DoD defines anti-terrorism as defensive measures to reduce vulnerabilities and protect U.S. forces and assets worldwide. Anti-terrorism thus represents one element of a broader approach to combating terrorism that also includes counterterrorism, terrorism consequence management, and intelligence support. The principal focus of DoD's efforts to combat terrorism is on bringing the fight to the terrorists abroad through the prosecution of the global war on terrorism. The next line of defense also lies beyond the borders of our nation, where we are patrolling the air and maritime avenues of approach to engage terrorists before they reach our borders. In this effort, the North American Aerospace Defense Command guards, patrols, and monitors the skies over and around Canada and the United States. And similarly, the U.S. Navy mans the sea approaches in international waters and works with the U.S. Coast Guard to patrol our territorial waters. Within U.S. borders, the domestic law enforcement community is responsible for countering terrorist threats. The Department of Defense, of course, stands ready to provide assets and capabilities in support of those civil authorities consistent with U.S. law. The third area of interest is the military's role in sharing intelligence with border inspection services. DoD policies and directives emphasize protection of the constitutional rights and privacy of U.S. citizens. In the absence of foreign involvement, military intelligence organizations are limited to performing non-intelligence functions in domestic support operations. If authorized by law to collect foreign intelligence or counterintelligence information within the United States, military intelligence organizations must do so only in support of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the lead federal agency responsible for intelligence collection within the United States. DoD is a full partner in the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, which began operations in May 2003 and whose function it is to close the seam between analysis of foreign and domestic intelligence on terrorism. Additionally, United States Northern Command has a well-established links of information and intelligence sharing on border activities, primarily through its Joint Task Force 6, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and the National Guard. And similarly, the National Guard in most of the 54 states and territories supports intelligence analysis efforts of the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Homeland Security, Bureau of Customs and Border Protection, and various federal, state, and local task forces. DoD is also now installing secure internet systems in many of the high-intensity drug trafficking areas, intelligence centers, to facilitate information sharing that has national security and homeland security value. The last area of interest I was requested to address is the role of the military in civil support and emergency preparedness in conjunction with U.S. land and sea border and inspection and enforcement authorities. As noted earlier, DoD's roles vis-a-vis border security is to support civil authorities, again, primarily the Department of Homeland Security, when requested. If the President or the Secretary of Defense are direct, NORTHCOM will lead DoD's response to requests for assistance from those lead federal agencies for border security operations. DoD also plays a supporting role through developing and maintaining good bilateral defense relationships with our neighbors. To the south, the U.S. has a positive, high-level relationship with the Mexican military, and U.S.-Mexican civil cooperation along our shared border is well established. To the north, we enjoy a close cooperative relationship with Canada across the board, to include the areas of counterterrorism, consequence management, and aerospace warning and defense. At the strategic level, the Permanent Joint Board on Defense epitomizes our close bilateral ties. At the operational level, that long-standing North American Aerospace Defense Command is a clear illustration of our binational commitment to counter aerospace threats to North America. In addition, a new binational planning group was established in Colorado Springs in December of 2002. That planning group is working to improve U.S.-Canada arrangements to defend against maritime threats to North American continent and respond to land-based attacks as well as civil support operations. Maritime Homeland Security is the responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security as the lead federal agency and is executed by the U.S. Coast Guard. Again, when directed by the President or the Secretary of Defense, United States Northern Command will respond to requests for assistance to augment Coast Guard maritime security operations. The Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, the Coast Guard, and the U.S. Navy are working together to establish a layered approach to maritime defense and security. In that same vein, the Department of Defense remains involved in supporting Coast Guard in port security and maritime domain awareness. Today we face a challenge that is equal to or greater than any we have ever faced before. Once we could readily identify and defeat our enemy in conventional warfare. Today we must cope not only with the threats produced by proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and missile technology among nation states, but also with threats posed by individual terrorists and terrorist organizations with global reach. The Department of Defense has a long tradition of support to civil authorities, including border authorities, while maintaining its primary mission of fighting and winning the nation's wars. As long as terrorist networks continue to recruit new members, plan and execute attacks against U.S. national interests, and seek out weapons of mass destruction, U.S. military forces and other DoD assets will remain engaged. Our goals are to thwart terrorist operations, disrupt their plans, destroy their networks, and deter others who might consider such attacks on our nation. U.S. military forces stand ready to defend and protect our homeland in overseas and domestic operations. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.